The crowded bus rattled down the busy city street, its passengers jostling slightly with every turn. It was one of those days when everything felt heavy: the weather, the atmosphere, the lingering tension that seemed to hang in the air. Among the sea of faces, most weary from long hours at work or school, sat a young boy named Jamal. Barely 16, Jamal had the kind of presence that made people notice him, though he never tried to stand out. His quiet demeanor, combined with his watchful eyes and gentle smile, gave off a warmth that even strangers found comforting. That day, Jamal had taken his usual spot near the middle of the bus, earbuds in, a half-worn backpack slung across his lap. He had just finished a grueling day at school, followed by an extra shift at the diner where he worked part-time. The weight of the day hung on him, but he didn't let it show. He'd been raised to carry his burdens with grace, a lesson his mother had instilled in him since he was young. As the bus came to a screeching halt at the next stop, the doors hissed open, letting in a gust of cold air. That's when she stepped on, a woman who immediately drew everyone's attention, though not for the reasons you might think. She was clearly pregnant, her hands cradling her rounded belly as she glanced around the crowded bus for a place to sit. Her face was pale, and there was an unmistakable tiredness in her eyes, the kind that spoke of long days and sleepless nights. Jamal noticed her immediately. Without a second thought, he stood up, pulling his backpack onto his shoulder and gesturing toward his seat. "Ma'am, you can take my spot," he said, his voice kind but firm. The woman hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering between Jamal and the seat he was offering. She seemed surprised, maybe even a little taken aback, but eventually, she nodded with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly as she lowered herself into the seat, exhaling as though she'd just put down a heavy load. Jamal moved toward the back of the bus, gripping one of the metal poles for support as the vehicle lurched forward. He didn't think much of his small act of kindness. It was how he was raised, after all. You see someone in need, you help them. Simple as that. But what he didn't know was that this moment, this one seemingly insignificant gesture, was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. As the bus rumbled on, the woman shifted in her seat, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small piece of paper, scribbling something onto it with quick, deliberate movements. Then, just as the bus approached her stop, she stood up and made her way toward Jamal. "Here," she said, pressing the folded note into his hand. Before he could ask what it was or even thank her, she was gone, disappearing into the bustling crowd outside. Jamal stared down at the note in his hand, a frown tugging at his lips. What could it possibly say? And why had she given it to him? He unfolded the paper slowly, his heart beginning to race as he read the first few words. Whatever was written there was enough to make his eyes widen, his breath catch, and his entire world tilt on its axis. This wasn't just a thank you note. It was something far bigger, something that would set off a chain of events he could never have seen coming. What could that note possibly say? And why had she chosen him, a stranger, to share it with? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Jamal's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the note. The words on the paper felt heavy, almost surreal, and his mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. The bus jolted forward again, but Jamal hardly noticed. He glanced around, almost as if expecting someone to be watching him, but the other passengers were lost in their own worlds. The city lights flickered through the windows, casting fleeting shadows across his face. The words on the paper weren't long or overly complicated. In fact, they were written in a simple, neat handwriting. But it wasn't what they said, it was the weight behind them that struck Jamal. The note read, "You don't know me, but I know your story. Meet me tomorrow at 4 p.m. at the park by 7th Avenue. I have something for you that will change your life." Jamal's pulse quickened as he read the note again, as though the words might change if he looked hard enough. His story? What did that even mean? He didn't have a story, or at least, not one anyone else would care to know. He was just a regular kid, living in a cramped apartment with his mom and little sister, trying to make ends meet. Life wasn't easy, sure, but it wasn't exactly the kind of thing you'd call a story. The rest of the bus ride passed in a blur. Jamal couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her tired eyes, the way she had looked at him, as though she saw something deeper in him than even he understood. Who was she? And how could she possibly know anything about him? By the time Jamal got off the bus and started walking home, the note was still clutched tightly in his hand. His neighborhood was quiet at this hour, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. He walked briskly, his mind still spinning with questions. When he reached the small apartment he shared with his family, the familiar sounds of home greeted him. His little sister, Mia, was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and sheets of paper. She looked up as he came in, her face lighting up with a grin. "Jamal, look what I made," she said, holding up a colorful drawing of what appeared to be their family, Jamal, Mia, and their mom, standing under a bright yellow sun. Jamal forced a smile, ruffling her hair as he passed by. "Looks great, Mia. You're gonna be an artist one day, you know that?" She giggled, but Jamal's attention was already elsewhere. He slipped into the kitchen, where his mom was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled faintly of tomato and spices. She glanced over her shoulder as he entered. "You're late," she said, her tone more tired than accusatory. "Sorry, Ma," Jamal replied, setting his backpack down on the floor. "Bus took forever." She nodded, turning back to the stove. "There's food on the counter if you're hungry. And don't forget to check on Mia's homework. She says she's done, but you know how she likes to rush through it." Jamal nodded, but he couldn't focus. The note in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric, its presence impossible to ignore. He wanted to tell his mom about it, to ask her what she thought, but something held him back. Maybe it was the strange, almost secretive nature of it all. Or maybe it was the fact that his mom already had enough to worry about without adding his cryptic mysteries to the list. That night, as Jamal lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was on the verge of something big. He thought about the woman on the bus, about her tired eyes and the way she had handed him the note as though it was something sacred. He thought about the words she had written and what they could possibly mean. By the time morning came, Jamal had made up his mind. He didn't know who the woman was or what she wanted, but he had to find out. There was no way he could just ignore something like this and go about his day as though nothing had happened. At school, Jamal found it almost impossible to concentrate. His teachers' voices faded into the background as his mind replayed the events of the previous evening over and over again. Even his friends noticed that something was off. "Yo, Jamal, you good?" his best friend Marcus asked during lunch, nudging him with an elbow. Jamal blinked, realizing he had been staring at his sandwich without taking a single bite. "Yeah, I'm good," he said quickly, though the look on Marcus's face told him he wasn't convincing anyone. "You sure? You've been acting weird all day." "It's nothing, man. Just had a long night, that's all." Marcus didn't press further, but Jamal could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Still, Jamal didn't feel like explaining. How could he, when he didn't even fully understand it himself? As the clock inched closer to 4 p.m., Jamal's nerves began to mount. He left school as soon as the bell rang, heading straight for the park on 7th Avenue. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of weather that hinted at the coming winter. When he arrived at the park, he scanned the area, his heart pounding in his chest. Kids were playing on the swings, couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers passed by with rhythmic precision. But there was no sign of the woman from the bus. Jamal sat down on a bench near the edge of the park, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He waited, watching the minutes tick by on his phone. 4:05, 4:10, 4:15. Just as he was beginning to think he had been stood up, or worse, that the whole thing had been some kind of cruel prank, he saw her. She was walking toward him from the far end of the park, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked different in the daylight, less tired, perhaps, but just as serious. Jamal stood as she approached, his throat suddenly dry. She stopped a few feet away, studying him with the same intensity she had shown on the bus. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. Jamal shrugged, trying to play it cool despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "I wasn't sure you'd show up either." The woman smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I suppose I owe you some answers." Jamal nodded, his heart pounding even harder. "Yeah, that'd be nice." But before she could say another word, a man appeared behind her, his expression dark and unreadable. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. "Not here," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "It's not safe." Jamal's eyes darted between the two of them, his confusion deepening. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman glanced at the man, then back at Jamal. "I'll explain everything," she promised. But not here. And just like that, the mystery deepened. The crowded bus rattled down the busy city street, its passengers jostling slightly with every turn. It was one of those days when everything felt heavy, the weather, the atmosphere, the lingering tension that seemed to hang in the air. Among the sea of faces, most weary from long hours at work or school, sat a young boy named Jamal. Barely 16, Jamal had the kind of presence that made people notice him, though he never tried to stand out. His quiet demeanor, combined with his watchful eyes and gentle smile, gave off a warmth that even strangers found comforting. That day, Jamal had taken his usual spot near the middle of the bus, earbuds in, a half-worn backpack slung across his lap. He had just finished a grueling day at school, followed by an extra shift at the diner where he worked part-time. The weight of the day hung on him, but he didn't let it show. He'd been raised to carry his burdens with grace, a lesson his mother had instilled in him since he was young. As the bus came to a screeching halt at the next stop, the doors hissed open, letting in a gust of cold air. That's when she stepped on, a woman who immediately drew everyone's attention, though not for the reasons you might think. She was clearly pregnant, her hands cradling her rounded belly as she glanced around the crowded bus for a place to sit. Her face was pale, and there was an unmistakable tiredness in her eyes, the kind that spoke of long days and sleepless nights. Jamal noticed her immediately. Without a second thought, he stood up, pulling his backpack onto his shoulder and gesturing toward his seat. "Ma'am, you can take my spot," he said, his voice kind but firm. The woman hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering between Jamal and the seat he was offering. She seemed surprised, maybe even a little taken aback, but eventually, she nodded with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly as she lowered herself into the seat, exhaling as though she'd just put down a heavy load. Jamal moved toward the back of the bus, gripping one of the metal poles for support as the vehicle lurched forward. He didn't think much of his small act of kindness. It was how he was raised, after all. You see someone in need, you help them. Simple as that. But what he didn't know was that this moment, this one seemingly insignificant gesture, was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. As the bus rumbled on, the woman shifted in her seat, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small piece of paper, scribbling something onto it with quick, deliberate movements. Then, just as the bus approached her stop, she stood up and made her way toward Jamal. "Here," she said, pressing the folded note into his hand. Before he could ask what it was or even thank her, she was gone, disappearing into the bustling crowd outside. Jamal stared down at the note in his hand, a frown tugging at his lips. What could it possibly say? And why had she given it to him? He unfolded the paper slowly, his heart beginning to race as he read the first few words. Whatever was written there was enough to make his eyes widen, his breath catch, and his entire world tilt on its axis. This wasn't just a thank you note. It was something far bigger, something that would set off a chain of events he could never have seen coming. What could that note possibly say? And why had she chosen him, a stranger, to share it with? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Jamal's heart raced as he looked at the man standing behind the woman. Something about him was unsettling, his sharp eyes, his rigid stance, the way he seemed to command the air around him without saying much at all. Jamal felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, his instincts screaming that this was bigger than anything he could have imagined. He thought about walking away, just turning his back and leaving this whole situation behind, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the look in the woman's eyes, or maybe it was the curiosity that had been gnawing at him since he first unfolded that note. "Who are you?" Jamal asked, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "And why do you keep saying it's not safe? What's going on?" The man's gaze shifted to Jamal, his expression unreadable. He didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Jamal thought he wouldn't. Then, finally, the man said, "It's not about who we are. It's about who you are." Jamal blinked, completely taken aback. "Me? I'm just a kid. I go to school. I work. That's it. You've got the wrong person if you think I'm anything special." The woman stepped forward, her voice softer than the man's but no less intense. "You don't give yourself enough credit, Jamal. You've been through more in 16 years than most people face in a lifetime. And you've handled it with strength, with grace. That's rare." Jamal's brow furrowed as he took a step back. "How do you even know that? You don't know me." She shook her head, a small, almost apologetic smile crossing her lips. That's where you're wrong. I know more about you than you think. She hesitated, glancing at the man as though seeking permission to continue. He gave a small nod, and she turned back to Jamal. You were just a kid when your father left, she said softly, her words cutting through the air like a blade. And after that, it was up to you to step up, to help your mom, to take care of Mia. You've been working, studying, sacrificing, doing everything you can to give them a better life. You've done it quietly, without complaint, and you've never asked for anything in return. Jamal's stomach twisted. Her words felt like an intrusion, like someone had been peering into the most private corners of his life. You've been watching me? He asked, his voice a mix of anger and confusion. Why? What do you want from me? The woman sighed, her expression softening. It's not about what we want. It's about what you deserve. What your family deserves. You're meant for something bigger, Jamal. You just don't see it yet. Jamal shook his head, taking another step back. This is crazy. I don't even know you, and now you're telling me I'm meant for something bigger. I think you've got the wrong guy. The man finally spoke again, his voice low and firm. You can walk away if you want. But if you do, you'll never know the truth. You'll never know what could have been. Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to leave, to get as far away from these people as possible. But there was a part of him, a small, stubborn part, that couldn't let go of the questions swirling in his head. Who were they? What did they mean by the truth? And why did they seem to know so much about him? After a long moment, Jamal finally nodded. Okay, he said quietly. I'll listen. But if this turns out to be some kind of joke or scam, it's not, the woman interrupted, her voice steady. You have my word. The man gestured for Jamal to follow, leading them out of the park and toward a narrow alley that ran between two old buildings. Jamal's nerves were on high alert as he glanced around, half expecting something to jump out at him. The alley was dimly lit, the faint hum of the city in the background. When they stopped, the man turned to Jamal, his expression serious. What we're about to tell you doesn't leave this alley. Do you understand? Jamal nodded, though his unease was growing by the second. The woman took a deep breath before speaking. Jamal, the life you've been living, everything you've been through, it's part of a bigger story. A story you don't even realize you're at the center of. Jamal frowned. What are you talking about? What bigger story? She hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Your father didn't just leave because he didn't want to be around. He left because he was trying to protect you. The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. What? Protect me from what? The man stepped forward, his voice low. From the people who wanted to use you. Your father knew they'd come for you eventually, so he disappeared. He thought it would keep you safe. Jamal shook his head, his mind reeling. This doesn't make any sense. Use me for what? I'm just a kid. The woman reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Jamal, you're more than that. You've always been more than that. The way you connect with people, the way you inspire them, it's not just coincidence. It's a gift, and there are people out there who would do anything to control it. Jamal pulled his arm away, his heart pounding. I don't believe you. This is insane. I know it's a lot to take in, the woman said gently. But think about it. Haven't you ever felt like there was something different about you? Something you couldn't explain? Jamal opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He thought about the times he'd managed to calm Mia down when no one else could, or the way people at work always seemed to gravitate toward him, even when he wasn't trying. He thought about the way strangers opened up to him, sharing their stories as though they'd known him for years. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. You will, the man said. But first, you need to make a choice. You can walk away right now and go back to your life, or you can let us show you the truth. Jamal looked between the two of them, his mind racing. Every fiber of his being wanted to say no, to walk away and never look back. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He had to know. Okay, he said quietly. Show me. The woman nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. You won't regret this, Jamal. I promise. But as they led him deeper into the shadows, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he wasn't ready for. The questions only grew louder in his mind, and for every answer he thought he might get, 10 more seemed to take its place. Whatever was coming, he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The alley seemed to stretch forever as Jamal followed the woman and the man deeper into its shadows. Every step echoed loudly in the confined space, and with each passing second, his unease grew. Questions filled his mind, swirling faster than he could process them. Who were these people? What did they really want? And how could any of this possibly have anything to do with him? At the end of the alley, they stopped in front of an unmarked door. The man pulled a key from his pocket, his movements quick and precise, and unlocked it. The woman gave Jamal a reassuring look, but it did little to calm the knot tightening in his stomach. "After you," the man said, holding the door open. Jamal hesitated, glancing back toward the park, the streetlights just barely visible in the distance. A part of him wanted to run, to get out of there and pretend none of this had ever happened. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when he was so close to getting answers. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with walls lined with shelves overflowing with books, files, and what looked like old photographs. A large wooden table sat in the center, its surface cluttered with papers and a single laptop. It felt like something out of a spy movie, and Jamal's nerves prickled with every detail. "Sit," the man said, motioning to a chair by the table. Jamal sat, his eyes darting around the room as the woman closed the door behind them. She moved to the table and began sifting through the papers, pulling out a thick folder and placing it in front of Jamal. "This," she said, tapping the folder, "is everything we know about you." Jamal's breath hitched as he looked at the folder. His name was written on the tab in bold letters. He hesitated before opening it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside were pages of information, school records, photos, even medical files. It was all there, every detail of his life laid out in black and white. "How did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "We've been keeping an eye on you for a long time. Ever since your father disappeared." Jamal's head shot up, his eyes narrowing. "You keep mentioning my dad. What does he have to do with this? Why did he leave?" The woman sat down across from him, her tone gentle but firm. "Your father was part of something much bigger than you realize. He wasn't just protecting you from people who wanted to use your abilities. He was protecting you from them finding out who you really are." Jamal frowned, his frustration growing. "You keep saying that, who I really am, but you're not making any sense. I'm just a kid. I don't have abilities. I'm not anyone special." The woman reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph. It was old and slightly faded, showing a group of people standing together. Jamal recognized his father immediately, younger and smiling, his arm around a woman Jamal didn't know. "Your father was part of a group," the woman explained. "People with unique abilities, people like you. They worked together to help those in need, to make a difference. But not everyone agreed with what they were doing. There were others, powerful people, who wanted to exploit those abilities for their own gain." Jamal shook his head, his heart pounding. "This is crazy. You're talking about abilities like it's some kind of superpower or something. That's not real. It can't be." The man finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You felt it, haven't you? The way people are drawn to you. The way you can connect with them, calm them, make them feel understood. It's not just charisma, Jamal. It's more than that." Jamal's chest tightened as memories flashed through his mind. The times he'd been able to talk Mia out of her tantrums when no one else could. The way strangers seemed to open up to him without hesitation. He had always thought it was just luck, or maybe a knack for understanding people. But now, hearing it framed this way, it felt different. The woman leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Jamal, your ability isn't just about connecting with people. It's about influence. You have the power to inspire, to lead, to bring out the best in others. But in the wrong hands, that same power could be used to manipulate, to control. That's why your father left. He knew they were coming for him, and he knew they'd come for you next." Jamal's head was spinning. "Who's they? Who are you talking about?" The man's expression darkened. "The organization your father fought against. They've been hunting people like you for years, trying to gather as many abilities as they can. Your father thought he could stop them, but when he realized he couldn't, he went into hiding to keep you safe." Jamal's mind raced as he tried to process everything they were telling him. It sounded impossible, like something out of a movie. And yet, the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that sent chills down his spine. "Why now?" he asked finally. "Why are you telling me all this now?" The woman hesitated, glancing at the man before answering. "Because they've found you. They know who you are, and they're coming. If we don't act now, it'll be too late." Jamal's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, too late? What are they going to do?" The man's jaw tightened. They don't just want to control you, Jamal. If they can't, they'll eliminate you. They can't risk someone like you falling into the wrong hands. Jamal's heart pounded as the weight of their words sank in. His life, everything he thought he knew, was crumbling around him. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into a void of uncertainty. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "Trust us. We'll protect you. But you have to trust us." Jamal looked into her eyes, searching for any hint of deception. All he saw was sincerity, a quiet determination that mirrored the storm brewing inside him. He nodded slowly, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. But before anyone could say another word, a loud crash shattered the silence. The door burst open, and Jamal barely had time to react before men in black tactical gear stormed into the room, their weapons drawn. "Get down!" the man shouted, pulling Jamal behind the table as chaos erupted around them. The woman grabbed the folder and stuffed it into a bag, her movements frantic but precise. Jamal's heart raced as he crouched behind the table, his mind screaming for answers even as the room descended into chaos. Whoever these people were, they weren't here to talk. And as the tension reached a boiling point, Jamal realized that his life would never be the same. Jamal's world exploded into chaos. The men in tactical gear shouted commands, their voices cutting through the tense air like thunder. The woman moved quickly, pushing the bag with the folder into Jamal's arms as she leaned in close, her voice urgent but steady. "Take this and run," she whispered. "Go through the back exit. Don't look back." Jamal's pulse thundered in his ears, his legs frozen as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. "I can't just leave you," he protested, clutching the bag tightly against his chest. The man crouched beside them, his eyes sharp and calculating as he pulled something from his pocket, a small, circular device that glowed faintly. "She's right, Jamal. You have to go. We'll hold them off. If they catch you, it's over." Before Jamal could argue, the man pressed a button on the device, and a blinding flash of light filled the room. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, his head spinning as the noise and chaos around him seemed to intensify. When he opened his eyes, the woman was pulling him toward a narrow hallway at the back of the room. "Go, Jamal," she shouted, her voice cutting through the haze. "Run." Jamal's legs finally obeyed, carrying him down the hallway and out through a hidden door that led into another alley. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he stumbled into the night, clutching the bag as though his life depended on it. Behind him, the sounds of the confrontation grew fainter, but he knew he wasn't safe yet. The alley opened onto a deserted street, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Jamal's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who were those men? How had they found him so quickly? And what was in this folder that was worth risking so much? He ducked into another alley, his back pressed against a cold brick wall as he tried to catch his breath. The bag felt heavy in his hands, its contents an anchor pulling him deeper into a sea of uncertainty. He unzipped it, pulling out the folder and flipping it open. Among the papers was something he hadn't noticed before, a small, sealed envelope with his name scrawled across the front in handwriting he didn't recognize. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a single piece of paper inside. The message was short, but it sent a chill down his spine. "You're not alone. Trust no one." Jamal's heart pounded as he stared at the note. Who had written it? And what did they mean by, "trust no one"? The woman and the man had risked everything to help him escape. Did this mean he couldn't even trust them? Before he could dwell on the questions swirling in his mind, the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. Jamal froze, his breath catching in his throat as he pressed himself further into the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of a radio. "We've got movement," a voice said, the words sharp and professional. "Sweep the area." He couldn't have gone far. Jamal's chest tightened as he realized they were searching for him. He clutched the folder tightly and looked around, his eyes darting for any possible escape route. A fire escape ladder hung just a few feet away, its metal frame rusted but sturdy. He moved quickly, silently climbing the ladder and pulling himself onto the rooftop. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like stars in the darkness. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of hope, Maybe he could disappear into the city, lose them in the maze of streets and alleys. But as he crouched behind an air conditioning unit, trying to stay out of sight, something caught his eye. Across the rooftop, a figure stood silhouetted against the night sky. Jamal's breath hitched as he realized it wasn't one of the men in tactical gear, it was someone else entirely. The figure stepped closer, their movements deliberate and almost familiar. As they came into the light, Jamal's heart stopped. It was a woman, but not the one he had just left behind. This woman was younger, her hair tied back in a loose braid, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. "Jamal," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. "You're in danger." Jamal blinked, his mind racing. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The woman held up her hands, a gesture of peace. "I don't have time to explain everything, but you have to trust me. They're coming for you, and if you don't leave now, they'll find you." Jamal hesitated, his instincts warring with the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "Why should I trust you? I don't even know who you are." The woman stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Because I know the truth about your father. About why he really left. And I know the people who are after you." Jamal's heart pounded as her words sank in. The idea of someone knowing more about his father was almost too much to process. But before he could say anything, the sound of helicopters overhead shattered the moment. Searchlights swept across the rooftop, their beams slicing through the darkness. Jamal ducked, his pulse racing as the woman grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the edge of the roof. "Come with me," she said urgently. "I can get you somewhere safe, but we have to move now." Jamal hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He didn't know who she was or whether he could trust her, but he didn't have much choice. The helicopters were closing in, and the men in tactical gear weren't far behind. As they climbed down the fire escape and disappeared into the shadows of the city, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that his world was spiraling further out of control. The note in the folder echoed in his mind, "Trust no one." He glanced at the woman beside him, her expression focused and determined. Who was she, really? And what did she know about his father? The questions weighed heavily on him as they slipped into the night, the danger growing with every step. But one thing was clear. The answers he sought were closer than ever, and he would have to risk everything to uncover the truth.